Well, thank you. This evening, I'm going to tell you about one of the most remarkable women that Northamptonshire has ever produced, a cross between Margaret Rutherford and Margaret Thatcher, a remarkable blend of historian and archivist. She's best remembered for two things: for spearheading the campaign to save our county's old documents by founding the Northamptonshire Record Society in 1920, and for saving Delapre Abbey from the bulldozer. I have been a member of the Northamptonshire Record Society for more than 35 years, and I've served on its council since 2012. As we started to prepare for the Society's centenary back in 2020, people suggested at a meeting that someone really ought to write a history of the Society, and I made the fatal mistake of not looking down at that precise moment. As a result, I dedicated a year of my life to ploughing through Joan Wake's own records, which we see on the left, deposited at the Northamptonshire Record Office, now based at Wotton Hall Park. And what an archaeological dig it turned out to be, ploughing through 355 boxes of material, including one folder labelled Funny Old Things, Unclassifiable. The collection had not been catalogued since she died in 1974, so I had to plough through all 355 boxes one by one. Luckily, as we can see on the right-hand side, her handwriting was remarkably legible. And, a historian's dream, Joan not only kept all the letters ever written to her, but in many cases she kept copies of the letters that she wrote. So this evening we're going to hear her story, largely by way of quotations from her diaries and from her letters. We're going to hear a first-hand account of Joan Wake's life, the life and opinions of a self-educated member of one of Northamptonshire's oldest landowning families. And it's a talk about our local history, shedding a fascinating spotlight on how someone from her background viewed the profound social changes in the first half of the 20th century. And it's all the more rare because we are seeing our history through the eyes of a woman. Joan Wake was born at Wotton Hall, just south of Northampton, on the 29th of February 1884. Her family had lived there since 1672. And the family, the Wakes, can trace its roots back in the county as far back as the 1200s, originally from Blisworth. Here we see Wotton Hall, probably in the 1890s. And those of you who drive along the A508 may recognise the gate lodge leading into the grounds of Wotton Hall. And here we see Joan's parents, Sir Harold Wake on the left, surrounded by books, somebody who really enjoyed reading and writing, and her beautiful mother on the right-hand side. Joan had three elder brothers. Being boys, they were sent off to prep school and then Eton College, but there was no question of any similar education for the three daughters. Instead, they were subject to tutoring at home, no expectation of going to school, and certainly no expectation that they would ever go to university. Here we see Joan in 1896 at the age of 12, as depicted by one of her siblings, scribbling away, reading, writing, a studious young girl. Of course, the upper class was very suspicious about the idea of girls being too highly educated. Compelling girls to do academic courses might cause their brains to overheat. At Wotton Hall, the family was simply following the convention of their class and the circle in which they all mixed. Here we see a Wake family gathering at Wotton Hall in 1897. And Joan is the girl seated on the ground, not so worried as her sisters about what might happen to her beautiful dress. We have a few glimpses of what her life was like, growing up on the Wotton Hall estate as a teenager. Her elder brother Goodwin was at one stage a prisoner of war in South Africa, and she would recall in later years a day out with her father, paddling on the River Nen, when they heard the church bells chiming, giving the news that the war was over. In 1900, at the age of 16, Joan was appointed the organist of Wotton Hall Village Church. The church launched a fundraising campaign for a new organ. Joan donated her annual stipend of £10 to the fund and helped with the fundraising campaign. A teenage girl with a great sense of energy and an ability to organise others. Bottom left, we see Joan banging away on the harmonium. Bottom right, we see Joan with her hat bossing the village choir. In 1903, Joan was presented at court, and she made this reference. I remember so well watching King Edward and Queen Alexandra in procession proceeding into the ballroom with all the court functionaries like Lord Spencer. The Queen looked so lovely. The King and Queen did wonders in making everything happy and lively again after Victoria's seclusion and the long drawn-out war. Queen Alexandra was a saint and an angel with the way she put up with King Edward's disgraceful carryings on. Luckily for us, Joan was a magpie, hoarding not only letters, but also photographs. The photograph top left shows the Wake family on the way to Road Village railway station, and they're going just over the road, the railway bridge on the A508, with the old George pub in Road in the background. And Joan kept this photo for posterity. And bottom right, we see a member of the Sitwell family of Weston, near Towcester, visiting the Wakes at Wotton Hall and sadly forgetting to put the brake on. We come now to 1914. And Joan made a detailed entry in her journal for the 6th of August. 8 days ago, on the 29th of July, I went up to London. I met Mr. Vernon, the Squire of Stoke Bruin, at Road Railway Station. He said to me, "Have you heard the news? Austria is at war with Serbia." "I'm glad," he said. "Now there's going to be something to read in the newspapers." Joan would later recall her father's reaction to the news of the outbreak of fighting, saying, "Like everyone else, though of course my father knew England had no other course than to fight the Germans, he was terribly upset by the outbreak of war. Village lads on Sunday afternoons in those days had the habit of walking together in groups of 4 or 5, and one Sunday we met a group. My father looked at them and, out of hearing, said, 'Cannon fodder.' It horrified me at the time, but how true it was, and how lucky we were that all my 3 brothers came safely through." In the year before, 1913, at the age of 29, Joan had flown the nest. Her restless energy had extended beyond just organising the village choir. It had turned her to books and a desire for an education that she hadn't had as a girl. And she signed up for a short series of university extension lectures run by the London School of Economics. In 1915, she was asked by the Squire of Easton Neston to look at some old boxes of deeds. She came across a 12th century document referring to the village of Hartwell, and her passion for old documents was ignited. In 1916, this restless, energetic, self-educated woman now aged 32, threw herself into the work of the Northamptonshire District Nursing Association. All of this boosted her confidence in fundraising and organising, and through it, she learned the art of speaking in public. Crucially, the association was led at the top by the grand ladies of Northamptonshire in the big country houses. As Joan said, her involvement led to useful contacts all over the county and gave me the entree to many of the larger houses to which, after the war, I was able to return to visit their archive rooms. On the domestic front, her life was turned upside down in 1916 by the death of her father. Wotton Hall now became the home of her elder brother, and the dowager and any unmarried daughters like Joan had to vacate. During the course of 1917, Joan left Wotton Hall. She would continue her involvement with the District Nursing Association, but it was records, not babies, that were taking up more and more of her attention. In 1920, it was suggested to Joan by some leading historians that somebody really ought to found a record society in Northamptonshire, tasked with rescuing ancient documents from destruction. The need had become pressing because so many old documents had been destroyed in the Great War as part of major paper salvage campaigns pioneered by the government. So record societies were popping up in other counties, and somebody with energy, drive, and determination needed to do the same here in Northamptonshire. Joan was ideally placed with the right connections with the big houses around the county who had centuries of old estate records hidden away. The Record Society was formally established on the 10th of December 1920. The local shoe magnate, James Manfield, was appointed as treasurer and chairman, and Joan was formally proposed as honorary secretary, a position she would hold for the next 43 years, unpaid. In 1923, the Record Society bagged its first large collection of records, the Grafton Collection. This was the collection of the Duke of Grafton, centred, the Grafton estate being centred around Wakefield Lodge that we see here, which is near Pottersbury, between Towcester and Milton Keynes. It comprised 3,700 items because the estate covered 15,700 acres at its peak, with property in and around 32 villages and hamlets. The following year saw Joan at Marston St Lawrence in the south of the county, the home of the Blenkos since the 1500s. The house had suffered a devastating fire in 1917, and Joan wrote, "They took me into the garden to an old summer house. They pulled out and spread for my inspection on the grass their deed boxes, full of charred deeds, all stuck together with damp and melted sealing wax, and rapidly decomposing from their damp and saturated condition." 1925 saw her at Overstone, collecting 50 large metal boxes deposited by the trustees of the will of the late Lord Overstone. At its peak, the Overstone estate had covered 40 parishes in Northamptonshire. This was the largest deposit to date, and one of 22 major deposits to be received between the wars. May 21st, 1925. I caught the 9:45 a.m. train to Oundle. I went to Cotterstock. I tried Lady Ethel Wickham's motorbike, and I bought it for £25. I caught the train back to Northampton. Luckily for us, one of Joan's siblings decided to sketch her on her intrepid motorbike, which we see bottom left. Until now, 1925, she had been relying on a bicycle and public transport to rescue all these documents. For the next 10 years, from 1925 to 35, she was to be seen careering around the roads of Northamptonshire on her motorbike, until, in 1935, at the age of 51, she would buy her first motor car, which we see top right. A Morris 8 soft top. That cost her £100. And she christened it Allegro, as in Allegro ma non troppo, as in fast, but not too fast. The motorbike with an Allegro would make it so much easier for her to call in on country house owners and solicitors' firms in her relentless pursuit of documents to be rescued. At 27th of January 1926, I had lunch with Mr. Dryden of Canons Ashby at Hazelrig House, which is, of course, now the Ladies' Club. Miss Dryden says I am being described as the best burglar in the county. But it didn't always go Joan Wake's way. Top left, we see Drayton House. 23rd of March 1927, I dined with the Stopford Sackvilles at Drayton, and I heard with distress that they are tidying up, and they have burned a lot of old accounts. 10th of July 1928, I went to Child's Bank in London to ask Lord Fame if he would deposit the Westmoreland manuscripts, formerly at Apethorpe. Flat and heated refusal. Luckily, she had better luck when she went to Brock Hall, the home of the Thorntons, between Northampton and Daventry. A beautiful old house. They've lived there since 1625. It's 12 miles from here, and although I have known the family for 25 years, I've never been there before. You see, before the days of cars, a place that distance was quite out of reach, unless you were very intimate with the people. I went through 16 large boxes of documents. In 1929 appeared one of the books written by the Society about law and order in 13th century Northampton. As the book reminded its readers, Northamptonshire lies in the middle of England, with 9 counties bordering its shire. Northampton itself is the meeting place of more ancient roads than any other county town. And of course, 2 of the most important councils of Henry II's reign were held here, and King John visited the town on no less than 30 occasions. Books like these, being edited by Joan and other historians, were quickly reinforcing the reputation of the Northamptonshire Record Society as one which no serious student of English medieval history could ignore. 1930 saw Joan visiting friends at Lockinge, near Wantage, in Berkshire. And this is what she said: "The luxury here is embarrassing. Yesterday, the family all went to London for the night, and I had a butler and footman to wait on me at lunch, and I ate with 4 eyes fixed upon me and fidgeting about behind my chair. I hastily finished my plate, and I went to the sideboard to get some cheese. To my dismay, the door burst open again, and I was caught in the guilty act of helping myself. I hurried back to my table in confusion, and the butler skillfully pushed my chair under me as I sat down." In September 1930, Joan persuaded Lord Winchelsea to deposit the Finch Hatton papers, the family that had long owned Kirby Hall near Corby, and that collection arrived in 20 packing cases. Since the Society had been founded in 1920, it was entirely dependent for income on what its members would provide. There was no public funding to rescue any of these documents, let alone do anything to preserve them. It was entirely a matter of what Joan could raise in funds. The county council did provide some accommodation free of charge. For the first 10 years, it consisted of a couple of rooms at the Abington Street Library, and then from 1930, new free rooms were provided at no cost at County Hall in Guildhall Road. As a marketing and fundraising campaign, Joan would do anything she could do to get stories in the local press when we had a good local press. Here we see Joan, fourth from the left, the only woman in what was essentially a man's world. In the following year, she took another opportunity to get fundraising and marketing for the society, this time hosting a 6-day exhibition of old clothing, including a 17th century dress loaned by Queen Mary. All good to raise the profile of the society amongst the people of Northamptonshire and try to get money in to save the records. She wrote to all the Northamptonshire shoe barons asking for money to help the Record Society. Shoe magnate John Marlowe of Sedgebrook said, no, it was not a good time to be asking for money. Frank Panther of Wotton Hall, just north of Northampton, said, no, times are too hard for the shoe industry to help you. 1932 saw Joan at Fawsley, near Daventry, the home of the Knightley family since 1416. The house itself, which we see here, had actually lain empty since 1913. And it took her a lot of persuasion to get Sir Charles Knightley to break open the archives room, which hadn't been entered for 10 years. In 1934, Joan reached the age of 50. She said, I hate and loathe being 50. I've never minded a birthday before, and I don't think I shall mind 60 if I get that far. But 50 to me sounds deadly dull. A solid woman, a widow in a black dress covered with jet and a cap. May 1935. 3.5 days clearing out a solicitor's attic in Daventry. I've made a great study of the habits of solicitors. The deeds of their clients are kept in tin boxes in a strong room in the basement, but other papers no longer needed are taken upstairs to the attic. After much persuasion, I was allowed to go up to the attic of this particular firm in Daventry, where I found the whole floor 2 or 3 feet deep in a promiscuous heap of documents, 2 centuries of them, I would say, smothered in dust and dirt, but preserved from damp by broken window panes, which ensured a circulation of air. It was like an archaeological dig. And as we see here, Joan again took the opportunity to get a press cutting to promote the society. Joan was very good at making passing comments to friends and family, what she thought about the events happening in her time. For example, 1936, the death of King George. The King's death was very sad. He did his job marvellously well in his quiet, unostentatious way. Perhaps he was more successful than a much cleverer man would have been. Here on the left-hand side, we see a newspaper cutting of Edward VIII when Prince of Wales out hunting in one of the Northamptonshire villages with the Pytchley hounds. And on the right-hand side, we see the Duke of York in the Pytchley hunting pink. 1937, a Record Society outing. I think this time to Kirby, and Joan again uses every opportunity to get press coverage. She's not the only woman in this photo. In the same year, 1937, Joan launched a photo competition in the local press urging the public to record all the old cottages shortly to be altered or pulled down by local councils. There is no doubt, she said, that Northamptonshire is rapidly disappearing before our eyes. Indeed, Joan went on to accuse local councils of building hideous new eyesores and disfiguring the county in the process. 13th of October 1937, we had Bloody Mary in the county, and she was quite an archaeological society, going round with a procession of cars to Lilford, Kirby, Dean, Elton, Apethorpe, Easton Neston, Ainhoe, Canons Ashby. The Brudenells of Dean sent me an SOS to come and entertain her at Dean, so I went. It was her first day's outing. She started with a party of 12 from Althorpe. They got to Dean soon after 4. Tremendous preparations. Half the village, as well as the servants, had been scrubbing, sweeping and dusting for a week beforehand. In fact, it was a jolly good thing she came, because it made them clean up the place for a bit. 1938, of course, would be overshadowed by the Munich crisis and the threat of another war. As early as January 1938, Joan was starting to worry about where her records should be moved to if another war did break out, convinced that Northampton itself would be bombed. And she fell on the idea of Brixworth Hall, which we see bottom left, and Overstone Girls' School, which we see top right. And then, of course, came the war in September 1939. The actual work began on the 2nd of September, and it took Joan 6 days with one large van, 4 men, to remove all the records from the Guildhall Road to these venues. It involved 13 tons of records, the accumulations of 20 years, all thanks to Joan. 1940 saw Dunkirk, and by now, luckily for us, Joan was writing very detailed diary entries, writing entries for posterity, for people like us to enjoy in years to come. One of her entries is for June 1940, and she said this: "We expect the parachutists at any moment. For these, my brother Hereward is quite ready with a county force of some 10,000 men. We are lending our field glasses for the watchers who are keeping watch on the church towers. A week ago, I went into Northampton, an extraordinary sight, chock-a-block with soldiers, young fresh ones who haven't been to France, and ones just back, English, Belgian, French, in helmets mostly, footsore and tired, hundreds of them. You can spot them at once, but cheerful and looking less like a defeated army than anything I ever saw. I spoke to 2 of them who were buying new boots in a shop. They told me they had to crawl for hours along the sand dunes, burying themselves in when the bombs began to drop." 14th of June 1940. My roses are out and Paris has fallen. I'm waiting for the Queen to speak to the French. Marvellous fellow Hitler. He always keeps to his timetable. When we hear the church bells, we shall know the parachutists have arrived. Just imagine the feelings of the men who built those church towers centuries ago, knowing they would be used to give warning now of enemies dropping from the skies. On the 23rd of August 1940, the war reached Wotton Hall. Those infernal Germans machine-gunned Wotton Hall today, the stables and the park. The groom heard the shot in the elm tree. There were 3 bursts of fire. We think he was trying to get the sheep in the park. I was in Northampton at the time, and I heard nothing till I got back to Road, which the devil had also machine gunned, but luckily did no damage. At 1941, I've just been staying here at Dean. There were 162 people sleeping under the roof. 4 of them family, 2 servants, the rest the army. There is no jingo about this war, not even any romanticising or dramatising of it to ourselves, just a grim, horrible, business-like business of getting ready for the hard struggle and inevitable slaughter, which we try to hope won't happen, but feel at the back of our minds is coming. For why should we escape? And every now and then in Libya or at sea, some young fellow, one knows, is killed. It's worse for the fathers in this war, I think, because they've been through it all themselves. May 1941, I went to London. I went to Westminster to have a look at the Abbey, as it might be my last, and I went past St Paul's, then back to Northampton. Air raid warning during the night, Huns streaming and roaring overhead. I went to London in a furniture van to rescue and put in a safer place down here 2 very important Northamptonshire collections, which, after negotiations and some trouble, I forced a dilatory Duke of Buccleuch and a reluctant Earl of Westmoreland to let me get away. Alas, one collection had already been badly blitzed. A third of it had been ruined, and I am at this moment drying the remainder in my garden. June 1942. The BBC has invited me to do a broadcast. It's now supposed I give it on their In Britain Now series, a silly sort of variety show, and I am only to have 4.5 minutes to talk about the importance of saving records. It may do some good. A young man at Bristol BBC rewrote my script in his own BBC style, which didn't happen to be my style, and I refused to read it. They really are the limit. The 25th December 1942, I went over to Barnwell the other day to inspect some records in the old almshouses. I lunched with the Duke and Duchess of Gloucester. I hadn't met him before. A pleasant, good-humoured man, very happy in the guise of a country gentleman. Before that, I was at Dean, where the documents are in such peril, all means of access completely blocked except for one narrow staircase. If they had a fire, they wouldn't have a chance. October 1943, I went to Boughton House. The park was full of black American soldiers, under canvas, poor devils. Their lorries and jeeps and tanks have cut up the drive very badly. A huge camp near the lodge and another down by the house. We see the house on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, we're looking at a scene in the stables, and on the floor is one of the effigies from the collection of royal tombs, which had been in Westminster Abbey, and which were at one stage moved to Boughton for safekeeping, before they were later moved to mines deep in Wales. (1944) saw Joan at Buckingham Palace to witness one of her brothers receiving a knighthood. Joan, in her diaries, lamenting the shabby state of the palace and looking and observing how George VI looked so much older than he had been before the war. 2nd of May 1944, I went to Burglar House near Stamford. A gale of wind. The military traffic is quite detestable. Gigantic vehicles, American most of them, roaring along the roads in processions. My hat blew off twice into the hedge, on the opposite side of the road. But I got to Burley in time for tea. I unpacked my rations. The Marchioness of Exeter refused my offer of margarine, but she did take my rations of bacon and tea and sugar. May 1945, victory in Europe. I'm now staying in the village of Cosgrove, where everybody was wreathed in smiles. On the second night, they had another bonfire and they burnt Hitler in effigy in an old armchair. They danced in the village street and got as drunk as they could manage on the very weak beer allowed by the government. And then came the general election of 1945. One of Joan's nephews followed Winston in his car as Winston went from Buckingham through to Towcester. Joan's nephew got caught up in the mayhem, seeing so many people in the villages standing by the side of the road and cheering as Winston went past. Joan's nephew said, "Aunt Joan, what a morning. This election, it's in the bag for the Conservatives." Joan saw it slightly differently. At 30th of June 1945, I motored to Oxford. I gave a lift to a young waff. She admires Churchill, but she's going to vote Liberal. Then I gave a lift to a young airman. He admires Churchill, but is going to vote Labour and says 85% of the forces will do the same. 19th of June 1946, I drove to Dean. I spent the night there. I found the Brudenells well, and it's lovely to see the house free from troops, but rather knocked about. Many of the old panes of glass have been broken in those lovely old windows. I made the Brudenells promise to have them put back when they get their compensation money from the War Office. All the Yanks seem to have gone home, and a good thing too. There is still a POW camp at Boughton, but it's great to have the signposts back on the roads. And it's nice doing a long run in my car again after all these years. More traffic than there was, but motoring is still quite pleasant. Alas, they are building new houses in every village. July 1946, to Cannons Ashby, a bitterly cold day. We had a welcome fire in the drawing room after dinner. I packed and put away the old Dryden family letters. The house is a museum. Lovely old furniture, 16th or 17th century armour, family portraits everywhere. I was sorry to see the woodworm in some things, and the moth is getting into the carpets too, which have not been up for 8 or 9 years. August 1946 saw Joan visiting Wakefield Lodge at Pottersbury, the former seat of the Dukes of Grafton. She said, "Such a scene of desolation you've never seen in your life. The drive's in a frightful state, the house falling into ruin. The doors were open and I went around the ground floor. Beautiful, fine plasterwork, all dirty and defaced and scrawled all over in Italian, because the Macaroni prisoners had been quartered here. The Rose Garden, a wilderness. Bank holiday makers picnicking everywhere, quite unimpeded, no doubt singing their Magnificat in their hearts, "He hath put down the mighty from their seat." This is a symbol. Our lot is completely and utterly done for. And you can understand why Joan was feeling so pessimistic. It was a bad time for the country houses in the late 1940s. The system of listing properties to save them was only starting to be rolled out by the Attlee government. Here we see Blatherwick on the way to Stamford, a beautiful 18th century house. That was demolished in 1948 before the listed building officer could get there to save it. Here we see Sulby Hall on the way to Rugby, the seat of Guy Paget, whose son Reggie would be the Labour MP for Northampton for so many years. A beautiful house, demolished in 1952, again before the listed building officer could arrive to save it. Here we see Brixworth, where many of the county's archives had been stored by Joan during the war. That goes in 1954. And here we see Billing Hall in the centre of Great Billing, one time home of the Elwes family. That goes in 1956. So one can understand Joan's uncertainty about what lay ahead. These houses were treasure houses, not just in terms of architecture, but in terms of all the documents accumulated by the ancestral families. Joan was very conscious that something big was happening, that not only were the country houses at risk, but that her type, if you like, the old landed aristocracy and landed gentry, were on their way out. She talked of social revolution. Here we see the 7th Earl Spencer and his wife Cynthia. March 1947, Cynthia told me that she and Jack were travelling by train to London the other day. They were lunching in the first-class restaurant car. They were offered apples, but Jack Spencer doesn't eat apples, and he asked if he might have some cheese instead. No, sir, the waiter said. Cheese is reserved for the third-class passengers. And so, said Joan, our social revolution goes merrily on. Now, what to do with these great collections of records that Joan had been accumulating since 1920? With the end of the war, she felt that Brixworth was not really appropriate. Overstone Girls' School wanted its basement back, and the collection had certainly outgrown any offices that the county council could offer in Guildhall Road. So she fell on the idea of Lamport Hall, the ancestral home of the Ishams. And for 11 years, from 1947 to 1958, Joan would rent a succession of rooms from Sir Giles Isham. We see notepaper here recording Lamport as the base. And we see the library at Lamport, which was the reading room for people using the Record Society. And we see Joan on the left-hand side. Lamport had a narrow escape, like so many of the country houses. At one time, there were Czechoslovakian, British, Italians there. One of them decided to draw Rita Hayworth, that you see top left, and then another person tried to assassinate her. And bottom right, we see one of the Italian prisoners of war deciding to carve POW in the beautiful Northamptonshire stonework in the stable block at Lamport. The legacy of war. 22nd of June 1948. Remains of huge huts and sheds and concrete still in Southsea Forest. There were RAF stores everywhere. They have nearly removed all the ammunition along the by-roads, which is a great improvement, but the black corrugated iron shelters are everywhere still, all along the roads between Stony Stratford, Buckingham, Olney and Bicester. 4th of August 1949. 35 years ago, since my world came crashing down in ruins with the outbreak of the First World War. Life in England is terribly sad for the likes of us who have known better days. Every week, a great country house and all that it has meant for centuries comes crashing down like the bombs in the war. In 1950, it was disclosed in the national press that there were plans for a vast expansion of open cast mining of iron ore in the north of the county. The national press went into overdrive, saying, Northamptonshire is paying a shocking price for steel. Open cast mining has made ugly deserts out of farmland and now threatens a further 70,000 acres. Unless compulsory restoration is imposed, we shall leave a legacy of dead land in the heart of England. Joan became extremely agitated about this. She threw her considerable weight behind the campaign to prevent this and to ensure that farm land already being quarried would be returned in a fit condition. On the 1st of January 1952, some 31 years after its creation back in 1920, the Record Society handed over to the County Council the responsibility for the custody of all the records at Lamport Hall. And Northamptonshire Record Office now came into being. Over the past 3 decades, Joan had used her powers, in her own words, as a cross between a missionary and a ferret, to secure more than 80 extensive collections deposited by landowners and solicitors, as well as scores of smaller collections, now occupying 11 rooms at Lamport Hall. In 1953, Joan finally received some national recognition for all her work over the past 33 years, being awarded an honorary MA by the University of Oxford. Here we see her with the warden of Wotton College, Maurice Bowrer. The following year, she was finally able to get away on holiday, visiting her brother, who had a home, a mini version of Wotton Hall, in the Rhodesian bush. But above all else, 1953 was the year Joan turned her attention to Delapre Abbey, a place she had had her eye on since the early 1940s as a suitable permanent home for the county archives. Delapre had been the home of the Bouverie family from 1764 until the death of Miss Mary Bouverie in 1943. In 1946, her relatives had sold the house and about 580 acres of land to Northampton Town Council. The building had then been used by a succession of national and local government organisations, but by 1953, the house was lying empty and its future was uncertain. It was still a very dangerous time for country houses up and down the country. They were being demolished at a rate of one every fortnight. Even her own ancestral home, Wotton Hall, had been under threat, but to her delight, her nephew Toby, later Sir Joan Wake, who would die in 2017 at the age of 101, Toby decided to save it. January 1954. The Chronicle and Echo publishes this report about Delapre. Delapre Abbey will be demolished if the Town Council approves a recommendation from the Finance and General Purposes Committee on Monday. The committee is making this recommendation in light of the general condition of the fabric and the capital expenditure and the maintenance charges which the retention of the buildings would involve. When Joan heard about this proposal, she went straight to the Chronicle and Echo and said this: "I feel sure I am speaking on behalf of all members of the Northamptonshire Record Society when I say that the proposal to demolish Delapre Abbey is deplorable. It would be an act of sheer vandalism to destroy it." At this precise time, the Town Council was run by the Conservatives, and they disagreed with Joan. One Conservative councillor said, "With the exception of a first glance at the south front, there is nothing at Delapre that could pass as anything of architectural beauty. And if there is any question of vandalism, then the accusing finger should be pointed to the families who occupied the building in the past and paid so little attention to its condition." Another Conservative town councillor says, "The building lacks any merit. I can view the demolition of Delapre Abbey without a single aesthetic twinge. In fact, I do not believe Delapre Abbey has meant anything to this town for generations. A third Conservative town councillor said, "The time has come for practical economics." Delapre Abbey's only historical importance was its demolition by Henry VIII. The best thing we can do is pull it down before it costs us too much money. Joan commented to a friend, "The fact is, the present members of the town council are a very poor type and quite unfit to be entrusted with such a responsibility as a fine old building, and I now understand the deplorable architectural mess they have made of the middle of Northampton in the last 30 years. Northampton Independent, 26th of November 1954. Why Delapre Abbey must die. Its fate seemed sealed. There was just one person that stood in front of the bulldozer, and that person was Joan Wake. Quite simply, she stared the Conservative town councillors in the face and defied them. She called on every contact she had built up over the past 34 years to rally to her cause, from sympathetic Labour councillors on the town council to her Conservative friends on the county council, from history professors at Oxford to her many contacts in Fleet Street and even contacts in the corridors of Whitehall. It was a remarkable display of power. And ultimately, it was the town council that blinked first. Shocked by the attacks she was making on them in the local press and the national press, eventually the town council said, "You can have the blasted building if you think you can raise the money needed to restore it." And so, at the age of 71, Joan launched the biggest campaign of her life. The Battle of Delapre had begun. In 1955, she roped in John Betjeman. She got him to write a supportive article in the Spectator magazine. She wrote to Betjeman, "Our lovely old stone-built villages have very largely been destroyed and replaced by red brick housing estates. And now the prejudice is spreading to houses like Delapre. I suppose Drayton, Rockingham, Burley, Castle Ashby, they will soon be at risk too." Little by little, money trickled in against all the odds. Initially, a deadline of the end of June 1956 had been made by the council. Under pressure, they had to extend the deadline by a further 6 months to give Joan the chance to raise the money. 18th of December 1956. The enthusiasm has been wonderful, and many delightful little incidents have occurred. For example, a lorry stopped outside our appeal office one day, and a hefty lorry driver walked in, and he put a 10-shilling note on the table. I thanked him and I asked him the reason for his support, and he said, "I'm tired of all this vandalism." 0 hour. A week tomorrow. Money came in from people across the county, from local businesses, particularly from the Cripps family in Road and from British Timpkin in Duston. And then, almost at the last minute, Joan pulled a blinder when her contacts in the heart of the establishment in London helped her to secure a magnificent gift from a major Anglo-American charity called the Pilgrim Trust. And so, as the chimes struck midnight on the 31st of December 1956, she had reached the target. And now the work began to rescue Delapre. Here we see her, second from left, and at the end, the county archivist who had succeeded her, Patrick King. The workmen battled with dry rot, wet rot, every sort of rot you could imagine. In October 1958, the building contractors handed over the Abbey to the county council. And over the next 3 weeks, 50 tons of records would be moved from Lamport to Delapre. It was the 9th of May 1959 that Delapre Abbey was formally opened. 1,100 people were there in the audience. One speaker said, "I have a very strong impression that if Miss Wake had been alive in the reign of Henry VIII, then the king would never have dared to dissolve Delapre Abbey." Of course, change was all around us. In November 1959, the first stretch of the M1 motorway was opened, and of all coincidences, it cut the Wakes Wotton Hall estate in two. Joan was not the best driver at the best of times. She had never seen a roundabout in her life, and so when coming from Northampton to Wotton Hall and being presented with Junction 15, let's just say it was a moment of utter chaos. She drove onto the motorway, had to be rescued at Newport Pagnell services by her family, having stopped a lorry in the process. In November 1959, Joan was awarded an honorary doctorate by the University of Leicester. This is what they had to say about her. In a destructive age, she has striven to save the landscape from industrial ravage, to save documents from campaigns misnamed salvage, and to save ancient monuments from ruin. For her, they are history alive and must not die. For Joan Wake, last ditches become front lines, forlorn hopes become victory. Quite simply, she inspired the campaign, she mobilized support, she fought for money, and she saved a beautiful historic house as a treasury of scholarship. In May 1960, the Northampton Independent wrote about her, saying, "The public's fancy was captured by the image of Joan Wake the warrior, a sort of Northamptonshire Joan of Arc, who was obviously afraid of no one, and who had been known to storm citadels of authority which few men, let alone women, would have had the temerity to assail. She is one of the most remarkable women this county has ever produced." In the same year, 1960, Joan was awarded the CBE in recognition of everything she had done. There is the M1 I was talking about earlier, and gosh, how she lamented thatch being removed from the cottages on the Wotton Hall estate. Quite what Joan would make of Junction 15 now, I hate to think. She was now approaching her 80s. We see her in the library at Delapre. And in 1963, after 43 years as honorary secretary, she retired from the Record Society, which by now was no longer looking after the records, but which was and is to this day primarily a publishing society, publishing the county's records. And she retired to Oxford, where she would continue to study and write books. For her 80th birthday, she commented, "I've known 6 generations of my family. My great-grandfather's sisters were born during the Napoleonic Wars. I saw them as a small child in 1891. When they had been young, they had walked up the Blisworth Road to see the first railway train coming through on the Euston Railway line. So you see what a link I am with the distant past." In 1971, the Northamptonshire Record Society celebrated its 50th anniversary, and we see Joan on the right attending an event of the Society for the last time. Later in that year, the Queen Mother formally visited Delapre Abbey. By then, Joan was too unwell to be there herself, and so the Queen Mother was shown round by Sir Giles Isham, the Squire of Lamport. 14th of November 1973. I'm getting very old. I'm practically an invalid now, as my legs are of very little use. But my head, that still works a little. Joan Wake passed away on the 15th of January 1974 in St Matthew's Nursing Home. She was 89, just a few weeks away from her 90th birthday. But remember, she had been born on a leap year, so she would insist to the end that she was only 21. Her nephew, Sir Hereward Wake, would recall, she sometimes wore a grey wig, often skewed or put on back to front. She was certainly not a practical person. Only on smart occasions would she attempt to use makeup, but let's just say she was not a very good shot with a lipstick. And liberal powdering of her face while still wearing her spectacles served only to impair her eyesight. The old Northampton journalist Lew Warwick said, Joan Wake could be very irritating, but so too could Winston Churchill. People do not achieve great things by being constantly charming and smilingly subservient. While due regard will always be paid to have massive contribution to the safeguarding of our local history, said Lew Warwick, she will be best remembered for something she did to stop change. For had there not been a Joan Wake, today there would have been no Delapre Abbey. But I leave the last word to Joan herself. To be able to look clearly down a long vista of 7 or 8 centuries into the past of one's own district adds a dignity to life and stimulates the best type of pride and patriotism. A place with no knowledge of or interest in its own history is a poor, pitiable thing, much as a man who has lost his memory. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the story of Joan Wake.